My name is Sarah Mitchell, I'm 28 years old, and I never thought I'd be physically blocked from sitting in the front row at my own grandmother's funeral. But there I stood at Elmwood Funeral Home, watching a security guard my father hired cross his arms and shake his head at me. "Family only in the front section," my dad Jeremy announced loudly, while his wife Linda smirked behind him. The entire room of mourners turned to stare as I stood there in my black dress, clutching the white roses I'd brought for Grandma Rose. That's when the lawyer approached me with his leather briefcase and whispered about a will reading tomorrow. That's when I realized this funeral was just the beginning of something much bigger. Before we dive deeper into this unbelievable story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and if this story hits close to home, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life family drama stories. You won't believe what happened when that will was read, so stick around because this gets absolutely crazy. Growing up, Grandma Rose was everything to me. After my mother died in a devastating car accident when I was only 12 years old, Rose didn't hesitate to take me in and raise me as her own. My father Jeremy had already started pulling away from our family even before the accident, claiming he needed space to grieve, but his idea of grieving involved moving 3,000 miles away to California for what he called a fresh start. While he was busy starting over, Rose was teaching me everything that mattered. She showed me how to cook her famous Italian recipes that had made her restaurant chain so successful across 3 states, taught me about growing vegetables in her backyard garden, and most importantly, she shared her incredible business sense that had built her empire from a single diner into 15 thriving locations. For 16 years, it was just Rose and me against the world. She attended every school play, every graduation ceremony, every milestone that my father missed. We'd spend Saturday mornings at the farmer's market selecting the freshest ingredients for Sunday family dinners, and she'd tell me stories about building her business from nothing after immigrating from Italy with just $200 and a dream. Rose always said I had her head for numbers and her heart for feeding people, and she'd promised that someday the restaurants would be mine to carry on the family tradition. Those were the happiest years of my life, feeling loved and wanted and knowing exactly where I belonged in the world. But then 5 years ago, everything changed when Dad suddenly reappeared with a new wife named Linda, a blonde woman 15 years younger than him who seemed overly interested in Rose's daily routine and financial situation. Linda would visit Rose several times a week, always asking detailed questions about the restaurant business, Rose's health, and whether she'd considered updating her estate planning. At first, I thought Linda was just trying to bond with her new mother-in-law, but Rose started expressing concerns to me privately. "That woman asks too many questions about my money," Rose would whisper during our weekly grocery shopping trips. "She keeps suggesting I'm getting forgetful and need help managing my affairs." Rose had always been sharp as a tack, managing her restaurant empire well into her 70s with the energy of someone half her age. But after Linda started her frequent visits, I noticed Rose beginning to seem more confused and tired than I'd ever seen her. She'd forget appointments she'd made, mix up the names of employees who'd worked for her for decades, and sometimes she'd call me 3 times in one day asking the same questions. When I suggested she see a doctor, she'd insist she was fine, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Linda was always quick to point out these episodes to everyone around, shaking her head sadly and talking about how heartbreaking it was to watch Rose's decline. The final month of Rose's life was a nightmare I'll never forget. She was rushed to St. Mary's Hospital after Linda found her collapsed in her kitchen, and when I raced there from my marketing job downtown, I discovered that Dad had already arrived and was meeting with doctors as Rose's designated power of attorney. When had that happened? Rose had never mentioned changing her legal documents, and she'd always told me that I would be the one to make decisions if anything happened to her. But there was Dad with official paperwork, making decisions about Rose's care while I sat in the waiting room being told I wasn't immediate family. Rose passed away on a gray Tuesday morning in October, and her final words to me still echo in my mind. I'd snuck into her room early that morning before visiting hours officially began, and she gripped my hand with surprising strength for someone so frail. "Sarah, honey, don't trust them," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the beeping machines. "There's a hidden safe behind the painting in my bedroom. Remember what I taught you about the restaurants. They're not who they pretend to be." Those were the last coherent words my grandmother ever spoke to me, and within hours, Dad had taken complete control of all funeral arrangements, explicitly excluding me from every decision about how we'd say goodbye to the woman who'd raised me. The morning of Rose's funeral felt surreal from the moment I pulled into the parking lot of Elmwood Funeral Home. 2 security guards in black suits flanked the entrance, each holding clipboards and checking names against what they called an approved guest list. I approached confidently, assuming there had been some mistake, but when I gave my name, the larger guard shook his head apologetically. "I'm sorry, miss, but your name isn't on the family list. You'll need to sit in the general seating area." The general seating area turned out to be the back 3 rows, reserved for acquaintances and business associates, not the granddaughter who'd lived with Rose for 16 years. I watched in stunned silence as people I barely knew filed past me to take seats in the family section. Dad's cousins from Nevada, whom Rose had seen maybe 5 times in the past decade, sat proudly in the second row. Linda's sister and her children, who'd met Rose exactly twice, claimed spots in the 3rd row. Meanwhile, I sat between Rose's mailman and a woman from her book club, feeling like a stranger at my own grandmother's service. The humiliation burned in my chest as I realized that Dad had systematically erased me from Rose's final goodbye, positioning himself as the grieving son who'd been by her side through everything. Dad's eulogy was a masterpiece of revisionist history that made me physically sick to listen to. He spoke eloquently about rushing back from California the moment he learned of Rose's declining health, painting himself as the devoted son who'd sacrificed everything to care for his aging mother. He talked about the difficult decisions he'd had to make regarding Rose's medical care, the sleepless nights he'd spent by her bedside, and the profound grief of watching dementia steal away the brilliant woman who'd raised him. Not once did he mention the 16 years I'd spent as Rose's primary companion and caregiver, the thousands of meals we'd shared, or the way she'd trusted me with every aspect of her business and personal life. Linda's performance was even more nauseating than Dad's fabricated stories. She sobbed dramatically at all the right moments, accepting condolences from Rose's friends as the devoted daughter-in-law who'd provided such loving care during Rose's final years. I watched her embrace Rose's longtime customers from the restaurants, assuring them that she'd do everything possible to honor Rose's memory and continue her legacy. Several people commented on how wonderful it was that Rose had found such a caring family member to look after her in her time of need, completely unaware that Linda had known Rose for less than 5 years and had spent most of that time trying to convince everyone that Rose was losing her mind. The most painful betrayal came from Rose's own sister Margaret, who'd been like a second grandmother to me throughout my childhood. When I approached her after the service, hoping for some comfort and support, she looked through me as if I were a stranger. "I think it's best if you give Jeremy and Linda some space to grieve," she said coldly, turning away before I could respond. Later, I learned that Dad had spent weeks before the funeral calling all of Rose's relatives, telling them carefully crafted stories about how I'd taken advantage of Rose's declining mental state and isolated her from her family. Even Uncle Frank, who'd taught me to fish every summer at Rose's lake house, avoided making eye contact with me throughout the entire service. Dad's nephews, Tony and Michael, took their role as character assassins seriously, whispering just loudly enough for nearby mourners to hear their poisonous commentary about my behavior. "It's disgusting how some people try to take advantage of elderly relatives," Tony muttered to a group of Rose's restaurant managers. Thank God Jeremy was there to protect Rose from being manipulated. Michael nodded sagely, adding his own fictional details about how I'd supposedly pressured Rose to change her will and cut out other family members. These same cousins had barely spoken to Rose in years, but suddenly they were experts on her final wishes and my relationship with her. The local newspaper's coverage of the funeral was the final insult in a day full of humiliations. The article, which appeared the next morning, featured a large photo of Dad and Linda placing flowers on Rose's casket, with a caption describing Jeremy as the devoted son who cared for his mother during her battle with dementia. The story painted a picture of a loving family coming together to mourn their matriarch, with special praise for Linda's dedication to providing care and support during Rose's final months. My name wasn't mentioned anywhere in the article, as if I'd never existed in Rose's life at all. As the service ended and people began filing out, a distinguished older man in an expensive gray suit approached me discreetly. He introduced himself as William Hayes, Rose's attorney for the past 30 years, and slipped me his business card. Mrs. Mitchell left specific instructions about her while reading, he said quietly, glancing around to make sure Dad and Linda weren't watching. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock at my office. Your presence is required. The way he emphasized required made my heart skip a beat, and I noticed Dad watching us from across the room with a concerned expression on his face. The final blow came as everyone gathered in the parking lot, making plans for the traditional family dinner that follows most funerals. Dad stood near his black Mercedes, surrounded by relatives and well-wishers, announcing loudly that the family would be gathering at Romano's, Rose's favorite restaurant, for a private dinner to share memories and begin planning for the future. When I started walking toward the group, assuming I was included, Linda stepped forward with fake sympathy dripping from her voice. "Oh Sarah, honey, this is really just for immediate family members. I'm sure you understand that Jeremy needs to be with his real family right now to process his grief." The parking lot fell silent as everyone processed this public exclusion, and I stood there feeling smaller and more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. William Hayes's law office occupied the top floor of the oldest building in downtown, with dark wood paneling and leather-bound books that suggested both tradition and serious money. I arrived 15 minutes early, my stomach churning with anxiety about what Rose might have left me, if anything at all. Given how completely Dad had rewritten the narrative of our family dynamics, I was preparing myself for the possibility that Rose had been convinced to leave me nothing, or maybe just some token jewelry to acknowledge our relationship. The receptionist offered me coffee and assured me that Mr. Hayes would begin promptly at 2 o'clock, once all the required parties had arrived. Dad and Linda swept into the office at exactly 2 o'clock, both dressed in expensive black clothing and radiating the confidence of people who knew they were about to receive very good news. Linda clutched Dad's arm possessively while scanning the opulent office with obvious appreciation, probably already calculating how she'd redecorate once she inherited Rose's money. Behind them came the extended family members who'd shunned me at the funeral, Aunt Margaret looking smug and expectant, Uncle Frank nervously adjusting his tie, and Dad's nephews Tony and Michael wearing identical expressions of greedy anticipation. The atmosphere felt more like Christmas morning than a solemn legal proceeding. Hayes was a tall, silver-haired man who commanded immediate respect as he arranged the documents on his massive mahogany desk. He explained that Rose had been very specific about how her final wishes should be handled, and that she'd updated her will multiple times over the past year to ensure her intentions were crystal clear. Mrs. Rose Mitchell was one of the sharpest minds I've encountered in 40 years of practicing law, he began, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone sit up straighter. Even in her final months, when some people questioned her mental capacity, she demonstrated remarkable clarity about her desires for her estate distribution. The reading began with standard bequests that seemed designed to keep everyone calm before the major revelations. Margaret received Rose's collection of Italian cookbooks and a modest $5,000 bequest. Uncle Frank inherited Rose's fishing equipment and $10,000. Various cousins and family friends received small monetary gifts and personal mementos, each bequest accompanied by a handwritten note from Rose explaining why she'd chosen that particular item for that specific person. Dad and Linda sat forward eagerly as these minor distributions were announced, clearly expecting their names to be called for the major assets at any moment. Then Hayes opened a thick sealed envelope and cleared his throat before reading Rose's words directly. To my granddaughter Sarah Mitchell, who has been the light of my life and the daughter I never had, I leave my entire business empire, including all 15 restaurant locations, the real estate they occupy, and all associated equipment and inventory, with a current estimated value of $3.2 million. I also leave her my primary residence, my vacation home at Lake George, and my investment property on Maple Street, with a combined estimated value of $1.1 million. Finally, I leave her my complete investment portfolio, bank accounts, and retirement funds, totaling approximately $400,000, for a total bequest of $4.7 million. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the antique clock ticking on Hayes's bookshelf. Dad's face went through a series of color changes, from pale white to deep red to an almost purple shade that made me worry about his blood pressure. Linda's mouth fell open so wide that I could see her dental work, and her perfectly manicured hands gripped her purse with enough force to leave permanent impressions. The other family members looked like they'd been struck by lightning, their expressions shifting from shock to confusion to rapidly building anger. "This is impossible." Dad finally exploded, jumping to his feet so violently that his chair rolled backward into the wall. My mother was clearly suffering from dementia. Anyone could see that she wasn't thinking clearly toward the end. This will was obviously written under duress, probably with coaching from someone who manipulated a vulnerable elderly woman. He pointed an accusing finger directly at me, his voice rising with each word. "I'll be contesting this immediately. No court in the country will uphold a document created through elder abuse and manipulation." Linda found her voice and immediately proved that her grief at the funeral had been completely fake. Her mask of mourning disappeared entirely as she launched into a vicious verbal attack that revealed the calculating woman she'd been hiding beneath her sweet facade. "You manipulative little witch," she screamed at me, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "You isolated that poor woman from her real family and filled her head with lies about people who actually cared about her. You're nothing but a gold-digging parasite who took advantage of someone with a failing mind." The transformation was so complete and shocking that even Dad looked surprised by the venom pouring out of his wife's mouth. The other family members quickly joined the attack, their earlier displays of unity against me now making perfect sense. Margaret stood up and began lecturing me about family loyalty and respect for elders, conveniently forgetting the 16 years she'd praised me for taking such good care of Rose. That inheritance should be shared among all of Rose's family members, not hoarded by someone who clearly manipulated her way into an old woman's good graces, she declared righteously. Uncle Frank nodded along, though he looked more uncomfortable than angry, probably realizing how his own treatment of me at the funeral would look in hindsight. Tony and Michael tag-teamed their assault on my character, building on the foundation of lies they'd already spread at the funeral. "We all saw how you kept Rose away from family gatherings," Tony announced, conveniently ignoring the fact that he'd attended maybe 3 family events in the past decade. "You made her think we didn't care about her so you could position yourself as the only person she could trust." Michael added his own fictional memories about times I'd supposedly prevented other family members from visiting Rose, stories that were complete fabrications but sounded convincing to people who wanted to believe them. Hayes listened to this chaos with the practiced calm of someone who'd witnessed many family meltdowns over inheritances. When the shouting finally died down, he opened another folder and pulled out additional documents. "I anticipated there might be some concerns about Mrs. Mitchell's mental capacity," he said dryly, "which is why she specifically requested that I document her decision-making process extensively. I have here medical evaluations from 3 independent physicians confirming her mental competency, video recordings of our meetings where she explained her reasoning in detail, and written statements from multiple witnesses who can attest to her clarity and understanding of these decisions." The threats began immediately after Hayes explained the strength of Rose's legal position. Dad hired the most aggressive attorney in the state that very afternoon, a man named Roger Sterling who specialized in will contests and had a reputation for using every dirty trick in the book. Linda announced that she'd be documenting every aspect of my relationship with Rose that she could remember or discover, looking for any evidence of manipulation or undue influence. The other family members made it clear that they'd be supporting Dad's legal challenge with both testimony and financial contributions, turning what should have been a time of mourning into an all-out family war. Hayes handed me a sealed letter that Rose had written specifically for this moment, along with keys to her house and detailed instructions about managing the transition of her business empire. As I sat there holding Rose's final words to me, surrounded by family members who now saw me as their enemy, I realized that the real battle was just beginning. The inheritance was mine legally, but Dad and Linda clearly had a coordinated plan to take it away from me, and they were willing to destroy my reputation and my relationships to get what they wanted. That night, I went home to my tiny apartment and read Rose's letter, which gave me the strength I'd need for the fight that was coming. Within 48 hours of the will reading, Dad's legal assault began with the precision of a military operation that had clearly been planned long before Rose's death. Roger Sterling filed a formal will contest alleging that Rose had suffered from progressive dementia that rendered her incapable of making sound financial decisions, and that I had systematically isolated her from her family while manipulating her into changing her estate planning. The legal documents painted a picture of a vulnerable elderly woman being emotionally abused by a granddaughter who'd taken advantage of her deteriorating mental state to steal millions of dollars from her rightful heirs. The financial warfare started immediately when Sterling obtained a temporary court injunction that froze all of Rose's accounts pending the outcome of the will contest. This meant I couldn't access any of the inheritance, couldn't pay the operating expenses for the restaurants, and couldn't even cover Rose's final medical bills that were still arriving in the mail. Dad knew exactly what he was doing when he chose this strategy, because the restaurants required daily cash flow to pay suppliers, staff, and rent, and without access to Rose's business accounts, the entire empire she'd built would collapse within weeks. The media campaign against me was coordinated and vicious, clearly orchestrated by someone who understood how to manipulate public opinion. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story about the will contest with the headline, "Family Fights Granddaughter's Inheritance Grab," featuring quotes from Margaret about her concerns that Rose had been influenced by someone who isolated her from people who truly loved her. The article included carefully selected details about the size of the inheritance and my relatively modest lifestyle, implying that I'd been planning this theft for years while living off Rose's generosity. Linda's attack on the restaurant business was particularly insidious because she understood that destroying Rose's reputation would make the inheritance worthless even if I eventually won the legal battle. She spread rumors throughout the community that Rose's restaurants had been serving expired food, that health inspectors had found violations that Rose had been too confused to address, and that several customers had gotten food poisoning in recent months. None of these claims were true, but they spread rapidly through social media and word of mouth, causing reservation cancellations and forcing several catering contracts to be cancelled. The employee situation became a nightmare as Dad and Linda's lies created confusion and fear among the restaurant staff who'd worked for Rose for years. Some longtime employees received anonymous letters claiming that Rose had been planning to fire them before her death, and that I intended to replace everyone with my own people. Others were told that the restaurants were being sold to a chain that would eliminate most positions, or that I was planning to close several locations to maximize my personal profit. Within a week, nearly 30% of the staff had quit, including 2 head chefs and several experienced managers who'd been with Rose for over a decade. My personal life became a battlefield as Dad hired a private detective named Marcus Webb to investigate every aspect of my background, looking for anything that could be used to support their claims that I was a manipulative gold digger. Webb contacted my former employers, college professors, and even high school friends, asking leading questions about my relationship with money, my ambitions, and whether I'd ever shown signs of being willing to take advantage of others. Several of my friends received anonymous letters containing twisted versions of private conversations we'd had about my frustrations with Dad's abandonment, presented as evidence that I'd been plotting to steal Rose's inheritance for years. The social media assault was particularly painful because it turned people I'd considered friends into prosecutors who questioned every aspect of my relationship with Rose. Linda created fake accounts to spread rumors about my character, posting in local community groups about how I'd supposedly prevented Rose from attending family gatherings and isolated her from longtime friends. She shared carefully edited photos from family events that made it look like I was always positioning myself between Rose and other family members, creating a visual narrative of manipulation and control that was completely false but devastatingly effective. My job at Davidson Marketing became another casualty of Dad and Linda's campaign when the firm started receiving anonymous complaints about my character and work performance. Someone sent my boss detailed accusations about my history of taking advantage of elderly relatives, along with copies of the newspaper articles about the will contest. While my supervisor assured me that they didn't believe the accusations, the negative publicity was affecting the company's reputation with clients, and I could see the writing on the wall about my future employment prospects. Sterling's legal strategy involved attacking not just my character but also the validity of Rose's mental state during her final months. He hired a physician named Dr. Patricia Henning, who claimed that she'd examined Rose 6 months before her death and found signs of cognitive decline that should have raised red flags about her decision-making capacity. This was the first I'd heard of Dr. Henning, and Rose had never mentioned seeing any doctor other than her longtime physician Dr. Rodriguez, but Sterling presented Dr. Henning's report as definitive proof that Rose had been suffering from undiagnosed dementia. Aunt Margaret's testimony became a cornerstone of Dad's case when she agreed to provide a sworn statement claiming that I had systematically prevented other family members from spending time with Rose during her final years. According to Margaret's new version of history, I had screening Rose's phone calls, discouraging visits from relatives, and filling Rose's head with negative stories about family members who really cared about her. The fact that Margaret herself had rarely visited Rose except during holidays was conveniently omitted from her statement, which painted me as a calculated manipulator who'd been planning this theft for years. The bank records became a weapon when Sterling's team found several large transactions from Rose's accounts that could be misinterpreted as evidence of financial exploitation. These included payments for my college tuition that Rose had insisted on covering, gifts she'd given me for birthdays and graduations, and reimbursements for expenses I'd paid on her behalf when she was hospitalized. Sterling presented these normal family transactions as a pattern of financial abuse, arguing that I'd been systematically stealing from Rose while she was too confused to understand what was happening. The first major legal victory for Dad's side came when Judge Harrison Williams agreed to extend the temporary freeze on Rose's assets pending a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding the will's creation. This decision was devastating because it meant the restaurants would continue operating without access to their normal operating capital, forcing me to watch Rose's life's work slowly collapse while I fought for the right to inherit what she'd wanted me to have. The judge's order also included a provision requiring me to provide detailed accounting of any gifts or financial support I'd received from Rose over the past 5 years, turning every act of grandmother generosity into potential evidence against me. By the end of the first month after Rose's death, Dad and Linda's coordinated attack had successfully painted me as a manipulative gold digger in the court of public opinion, destroyed my employment prospects, damaged the restaurant business that was supposed to be my inheritance, and isolated me from most of the family support I'd hoped to rely on during this difficult time. Their strategy was working perfectly, and I realized that unless I could find a way to fight back with equal determination and better evidence, I was going to lose everything Rose had worked her entire life to build, along with my own reputation and future prospects. My counterattack began with a desperate late-night internet search that uncovered the first crack in Linda's carefully constructed facade. While researching her background for my own attorney, I stumbled across a news article from Arizona dated 3 years before she'd met my father, detailing the suspicious death of her previous husband, Robert Chin, an 82-year-old widower who died just 6 months after marrying Linda. According to the article, Chen's adult children had filed a police report alleging elder abuse, claiming that Linda had isolated their father from his family and manipulated him into changing his will, but the case had been dropped when Linda suddenly moved out of state after Chen's death. Digging deeper into Linda's past, I discovered a pattern that made my blood run cold. Her maiden name was Linda Morrison, and she'd been married 4 times to men who were significantly older and wealthier than her average income would suggest she could attract naturally. 2 of these previous husbands had died under circumstances that their families found suspicious, and in both cases, Linda had inherited substantial amounts of money before quickly relocating to a different state. The similarities to what was happening with Rose were too obvious to ignore, and I realized I'd stumbled onto evidence that Linda was a professional predator who targeted elderly people with money. Dr. Rodriguez, Rose's physician for over 20 years, was outraged when I showed him Dr. Henning's report claiming that Rose had shown signs of dementia. "I examined your grandmother just 6 weeks before her death," he told me, pulling out his detailed medical files. Her cognitive function was completely normal for someone her age. She was sharp, articulate, and fully capable of making complex decisions about her business and personal affairs. When I asked him about Dr. Henning, Dr. Rodriguez frowned and explained that he'd never heard of her, and that Rose had never mentioned seeing another physician for cognitive concerns. The banking investigation I requested revealed a shocking pattern of forgery and financial manipulation that proved Linda had been systematically stealing from Rose during her final months. The bank's fraud department discovered that several large withdrawals from Rose's accounts bore signatures that didn't match her normal handwriting, and security camera footage showed Linda making these transactions while Rose was supposedly too confused to manage her own finances. Even more damning, Linda had been depositing these stolen funds into a secret account that she'd opened under her maiden name just 2 months before Rose's death. My investigation into the restaurant records uncovered evidence that Dad had been embezzling money from Rose's business accounts during her illness, using his temporary power of attorney to authorize payments to fake vendors and consulting companies that traced back to his own business interests. The forensic accountant I hired found over $60,000 in fraudulent transactions that had been carefully disguised as legitimate business expenses, proving that Dad had been stealing from Rose while publicly claiming to be her devoted protector and caregiver. The breakthrough in my case came when I tracked down Maria Santos, the private duty nurse who'd cared for Rose during her final weeks at home. Maria had been reluctant to get involved initially, but when I showed her the evidence of Linda's criminal background and the suspicious financial transactions, she agreed to provide testimony about what she'd witnessed. Mrs. Linda was always asking me about Mrs. Rose's medication schedule, Maria explained, and she kept insisting on preparing Mrs. Rose's meals herself, even though I offered to help. Mrs. Rose told me several times that she felt dizzy and confused after eating, but only when Mrs. Linda had cooked for her. Phone records subpoenaed by my attorney revealed extensive coordination between Dad and Sterling that had begun 2 weeks before Rose's death, proving that they'd been planning their legal strategy while Rose was still alive and presumably planning to contest any will that didn't benefit them. The records also showed numerous calls between Linda and Dr. Henning during the same time period, suggesting that the allegedly independent medical evaluation had been orchestrated as part of a coordinated fraud designed to support their claims about Rose's mental capacity. Linda's criminal background investigation revealed that she'd been using different variations of her name to avoid detection by authorities who might be investigating her pattern of elder abuse. In Arizona, she'd been Linda Morrison Chin, in Nevada she'd been Linda Chin Martinez, and in California she'd used Linda Martinez before settling on Linda Morrison when she'd met my father. This pattern of name changes, combined with her history of targeting wealthy elderly men, painted a clear picture of someone who'd made a career out of manipulating vulnerable seniors and stealing their assets. The insurance fraud discovery was perhaps the most damning evidence against Dad's claims of being a loving son who'd only wanted what was best for Rose. Investigation revealed that he'd increased Rose's life insurance policy to $500,000 just 3 months before her death, naming himself as the primary beneficiary while telling Rose that the change was necessary for tax planning purposes. The insurance company's records showed that Dad had specifically requested a policy that would pay out quickly in case of Rose's death, and that he'd been making inquiries about the claims process weeks before Rose actually died. My investigation into Rose's medication revealed evidence that Linda had been tampering with Rose's prescriptions in ways that could have hastened her decline and death. The pharmacy records showed that Linda had been picking up Rose's medications instead of Rose herself during the final 2 months of her life, and that she'd requested several changes to dosages that Rose's doctor had never authorized. Most suspiciously, Linda had filled prescriptions for medications that could cause confusion and memory loss when combined with Rose's existing heart medication, creating the very symptoms of dementia that she'd been pointing out to everyone around Rose. The second private detective I hired, Rebecca Torres, had extensive experience investigating elder abuse cases and quickly identified additional evidence that Dad and Linda's team had missed in their rush to steal Rose's assets. Torres discovered that Linda had been researching Rose's business and financial situation for months before Rose's health had started declining, including hiring her own private investigator to determine the exact value of Rose's restaurant empire and investment portfolio. This proved that Linda's interest in Rose hadn't been based on family affection, but on a calculated assessment of how much money she could steal. My attorney filed criminal complaints against both Dad and Linda with the district attorney's office, presenting evidence of elder abuse, fraud, forgery, and potentially even murder given the suspicious circumstances surrounding Rose's rapid decline and death. The criminal investigation would proceed independently of the will contest, but the evidence we'd gathered was strong enough that several family members who'd been supporting Dad started privately expressing doubts about the version of events they'd been told. Uncle Frank was the first to break ranks, admitting to me that Dad had pressured him to provide false testimony about my relationship with Rose. The restaurant employees who'd remained loyal to Rose's memory began coming forward with their own stories about Dad's suspicious behavior during Rose's final months. Several managers confirmed that Dad had been pressuring them to provide information about the business's financial performance and had asked detailed questions about Rose's day-to-day involvement in operations, clearly looking for evidence that could support claims about her declining mental capacity. These employees also verified that Rose had been mentally sharp and fully engaged with her business right up until her final hospitalization, contradicting every aspect of Dad and Linda's timeline about her supposed dementia. As word spread about the criminal investigation and the evidence we'd uncovered, the media narrative began shifting in my favor, with new articles questioning the original claims about Rose's mental capacity and highlighting the suspicious circumstances surrounding her death. The court of public opinion was slowly turning as people realized they'd been manipulated by Dad and Linda's carefully orchestrated campaign, and several restaurant customers began reaching out to express their support and share their own positive memories of Rose's final months when she'd been operating at full capacity. The criminal investigation into Dad and Linda's activities gained serious momentum when Detective James Morrison from the Elder Abuse Unit took over the case and began treating Rose's death as a potential homicide. Morrison was a 15-year veteran who'd seen every type of elder abuse scheme imaginable, and he immediately recognized the pattern of manipulation and financial exploitation that Linda had perfected through her previous marriages. The detective's investigation moved quickly because we'd already assembled most of the evidence he needed to build a strong case against both of them. The media reversal was swift and dramatic as new information about Linda's criminal background and the suspicious circumstances surrounding Rose's death became public knowledge. The same newspaper that had initially portrayed me as a manipulative gold digger now ran a front-page story with the headline, "Widow's Dark Past Revealed in Inheritance Battle," featuring details about Linda's previous marriages and the suspicious deaths of her former husbands. The article included interviews with family members of Linda's previous victims, who described patterns of behavior that were virtually identical to what had happened to Rose. The medical examiner's decision to reclassify Rose's death as suspicious and order an exhumation of her body sent shockwaves through Dad and Linda's legal team. The exhumation was necessary to test for traces of drugs or toxins that could have contributed to Rose's rapid decline and death, particularly given the evidence that Linda had been tampering with Rose's medications. Sterling immediately filed motions to prevent the exhumation, arguing that it was unnecessary and traumatic for the family, but his desperate legal maneuvering only made Dad and Linda look more guilty in the court of public opinion. Linda's arrest on charges of elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy came at 6 a.m. when police arrived at the expensive hotel where she and Dad had been staying since Rose's death. The arrest was captured by news cameras that Detective Morrison had tipped off, ensuring that images of Linda being led away in handcuffs would be broadcast on every local news station. Dad wasn't arrested immediately, but he was brought in for questioning as a person of interest in the criminal investigation, and his attorney advised him to invoke his Fifth Amendment rights rather than answer questions about his knowledge of Linda's activities. Dad's desperation became obvious when Sterling reached out to my attorney with a settlement offer that revealed just how much trouble they knew they were in. The offer proposed splitting Rose's inheritance 50-50 between Dad and me, with Dad dropping all claims that Rose had been mentally incompetent in exchange for me dropping the criminal complaints against him and Linda. The offer was laughable given the strength of the evidence against them, but it proved that Dad knew his legal position was hopeless and that he was looking for any way to avoid prison time while salvaging some portion of the money he'd tried to steal. The family dynamics shifted dramatically as the truth about Dad and Linda's scheme became undeniable. Aunt Margaret was the first to publicly apologize, admitting in a tearful phone call that Dad had pressured her to provide false testimony by threatening to reveal embarrassing information about her own financial problems. She explained that Dad had convinced her that I was manipulating Rose by showing her carefully edited recordings of conversations that made me sound greedy and calculating, but that seeing the evidence of Linda's criminal background had made her realize she'd been lied to about everything. Uncle Frank's confession about Dad's threats was particularly revealing because it showed the extent of the intimidation campaign that had been used to secure false testimony against me. Frank admitted that Dad had threatened to call in a loan he'd made to Frank's struggling construction business unless Frank agreed to testify that I'd prevented family members from visiting Rose. Jeremy told me that Sarah was trying to steal everything from the family, and that if I didn't help stop her, we'd all be left with nothing, Frank explained. I should have realized that he was lying when he started making threats against my business. The restaurant employees who'd stayed loyal to Rose throughout the crisis became heroes in the community as their stories about Rose's mental sharpness and business acumen in her final months contradicted every aspect of Dad and Linda's claims. Head chef Antonio Martinez held a press conference where he described working with Rose on menu planning and supplier negotiations just weeks before her death, emphasizing that she'd been completely lucid and fully engaged with every aspect of her business operations. Mrs. Rose was like a second mother to all of us, Martinez said, and anyone who spent 5 minutes with her could see that her mind was as sharp as ever. The community support that emerged once the truth became known was overwhelming and deeply moving. Rose's longtime customers organized a petition supporting my inheritance rights, and several local business owners offered to provide temporary financing to keep the restaurants operating during the legal proceedings. The mayor issued a statement praising Rose's contributions to the community and expressing confidence that her legacy would be preserved under my leadership, which was a dramatic reversal from the skeptical coverage that had dominated the media narrative just weeks earlier. The legal momentum shifted decisively when Judge Williams dismissed the will contest entirely, ruling that Sterling's team had failed to provide any credible evidence of Rose's mental incapacity and that the evidence of fraud and manipulation actually supported the validity of her final will. The judge's written opinion was scathing in its criticism of Dad and Sterling's tactics, noting that their claims appeared to be a coordinated attempt to defraud the rightful beneficiary of a validly executed will through a campaign of character assassination and evidence fabrication. Linda's breakdown in custody was captured on security cameras when she realized that her carefully constructed scheme was completely unraveling. She began offering to provide evidence against Dad in exchange for a reduced sentence, admitting to investigators that the entire plan had been her idea and that she'd manipulated Dad by convincing him that I was planning to cut him out of Rose's will entirely. Her attorney quickly negotiated a plea bargain where Linda would serve 15 years in federal prison in exchange for full cooperation with the investigation and restitution of all stolen funds. The financial reckoning was swift and satisfying as the court ordered Dad to repay every dollar he'd embezzled from Rose's business accounts, plus interest and penalties that nearly doubled the amount he owed. Since Dad didn't have anywhere near the money required for full restitution, the court authorized the seizure of his California property and investment accounts, effectively leaving him financially ruined as a consequence of his attempted theft. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Dad's greed had cost him far more than he would have received if he'd simply accepted Rose's original will and maintained a relationship with me. Dad's isolation was complete as former supporters abandoned him once the extent of his criminal behavior became undeniable. His nephews Tony and Michael, who'd been so eager to help spread lies about my character, suddenly discovered they had urgent business elsewhere whenever Dad tried to contact them. Even Margaret and Frank, despite their apologies to me, made it clear that they wanted nothing more to do with Dad's legal problems and that they considered him responsible for nearly destroying our family with his lies and manipulation. Linda's sentencing hearing was a moment of profound satisfaction as Judge Patricia Reynolds delivered a crushing 15-year federal prison sentence that reflected the severity of her crimes and the pattern of elder abuse she'd perpetrated across multiple states. The judge's comments during sentencing were particularly gratifying. Mrs. Morrison has demonstrated a calculated willingness to exploit the most vulnerable members of our society for personal gain, showing no remorse for the emotional and financial devastation she's caused to multiple families. The sentence included provisions requiring Linda to pay full restitution to Rose's estate and to the families of her previous victims, effectively ensuring that she'd never profit from her criminal activities. Dad's plea bargain was less satisfying but still represented a significant victory given how close he'd come to successfully stealing Rose's entire inheritance. Jeremy accepted 5 years of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service at a local nursing home, and full financial restitution of the money he'd embezzled from Rose's accounts. The plea agreement also included a permanent restraining order preventing him from contacting me directly and requiring any future communication to go through our respective attorneys, which was exactly the boundary I needed to begin healing from the trauma he'd caused. The restoration of Rose's estate to my control was an emotional moment that felt like finally being able to breathe again after months of suffocation. Judge Williams personally handed me the keys to Rose's house and restaurants, along with a formal declaration that I was the rightful heir to her entire $4.7 million inheritance. Standing in that courtroom, holding the documents that proved Rose's wishes would be honored, I felt her presence with me and knew that she would have been proud of how I'd fought to protect everything she'd worked her entire life to build. The business revival began immediately as news of my legal victory spread throughout the community and customers began returning to the restaurants that had been Rose's pride and joy. I rehired every employee who'd been forced to leave during the financial freeze, giving them retroactive pay for the months they'd been unemployed because of Dad and Linda's scheme. Several of the head chefs who'd left for other positions came back specifically to help rebuild the reputation that Linda's lies had damaged, and within 2 months, all 15 locations were operating at full capacity again. The family reconciliation process was complicated and painful, but ultimately necessary for my own healing and for preserving the relationships that Rose would have wanted me to maintain. Margaret and Frank both made formal apologies that went beyond their initial expressions of regret, acknowledging the specific ways they'd been manipulated into betraying me and taking responsibility for their roles in the conspiracy against me. While I accepted their apologies and agreed to rebuild our relationships gradually, I made it clear that trust would have to be earned back through consistent actions over time. The media vindication was particularly sweet given how thoroughly the initial coverage had destroyed my reputation and portrayed me as a manipulative gold digger. The same newspapers and television stations that had eagerly reported Dad and Linda's lies now featured extensive coverage of my legal victory, with headlines like "Granddaughter Vindicated in Inheritance Battle" and "Elder Abuse Scheme Exposed in Will Contest Case." Several media outlets invited me to do interviews about my experience, which gave me a platform to raise awareness about elder abuse and the tactics that predators use to exploit vulnerable seniors. The community healing process was deeply meaningful as people who'd been influenced by Linda's lies came forward to apologize and express their support for my efforts to continue Rose's legacy. The mayor organized a community celebration at the original restaurant location, where longtime customers shared memories of Rose and expressed their confidence in my ability to maintain the standards of quality and service that had made her business so successful. Local business organizations invited me to join their leadership groups, recognizing me as a legitimate business owner rather than the fraud that Dad and Linda had painted me to be. The charitable foundation I established in Rose's memory became a powerful way to channel my anger about what had happened into positive action that could help protect other elderly people from similar exploitation. The Rose Mitchell Foundation for Elder Protection provided funding for legal assistance, investigative services, and advocacy support for seniors who were being financially exploited by family members or caregivers. The foundation also sponsored educational programs to help elderly people recognize the warning signs of financial abuse and provided resources for reporting suspected elder abuse to authorities. My personal growth during this ordeal was profound and transformative, revealing inner strength and resilience that I'd never known I possessed. The experience of fighting for Rose's legacy had forced me to become a fierce advocate for truth and justice, skills that would serve me well in both business and personal relationships for the rest of my life. I'd learned to trust my instincts about people's motivations, to document important conversations and agreements, and to never again allow anyone to manipulate me through guilt or false claims about family loyalty. The new relationships that emerged from this crisis were based on genuine respect and shared values rather than the superficial family connections that had proved so fragile when tested by greed and jealousy. Several of the restaurant employees became trusted advisors and friends who demonstrated their loyalty during the darkest period of the legal battle. I also connected with other people who'd survived similar family betrayals, forming a network of support that understood the unique pain of being attacked by the people who were supposed to love and protect you. My professional transformation from marketing employee to restaurant empire owner was challenging but deeply satisfying as I applied Rose's business wisdom to expand and improve the operations she'd spent her lifetime building. I left my marketing job to focus full-time on the restaurants, implementing new technology systems, updating menu offerings, and developing expansion plans that honored Rose's commitment to quality while adapting to changing customer preferences and market conditions. The legal reform that resulted from my case had implications far beyond my personal situation, as lawmakers used the evidence of Dad and Linda's scheme to strengthen elder abuse prosecution guidelines and improve protections for vulnerable seniors. The district attorney's office used my case as a training example for prosecutors learning to recognize and prosecute complex elder abuse schemes, and several other states adopted similar legal reforms based on the precedent that my case had established.
The restaurant expansion I undertook in Rose's honor was carefully planned to preserve the family atmosphere and quality standards that had made her original location so beloved in the community. I opened 3 new locations over the course of 18 months, each one designed to capture the warmth and authenticity that Rose had insisted on in every aspect of her business operations. The new restaurants featured updated versions of Rose's classic recipes, prepared using the same high-quality ingredients and traditional cooking methods that had built her reputation for excellence over 40 years of serving the community. The employee ownership program I implemented was inspired by Rose's belief that the people who worked in her restaurants were family members who deserved to share in the success they helped create. I established a profit-sharing plan that distributed 20% of annual profits among all employees based on their length of service and performance, ensuring that the people who made the business successful would benefit financially from its growth. Several longtime employees were promoted to management positions and given ownership stakes in specific locations, creating a sense of investment and pride that translated into even better customer service and food quality. The community programs I developed turned Rose's restaurants into gathering places that served purposes far beyond providing meals, extending Rose's legacy of caring for people in her community. We began offering free meals for senior citizens every Tuesday, cooking classes for disadvantaged youth every Saturday morning, and space for community meetings and events at no charge for local nonprofit organizations. These programs not only honored Rose's memory but also strengthened the connection between the restaurants and the neighborhoods they served, creating customer loyalty that went far beyond the quality of the food. My relationship with Dad evolved into something that could barely be called a relationship, but which allowed for the minimal contact necessary to maintain family connections that Rose would have wanted preserved. He was allowed supervised visits during major holidays, but only after completing anger management counseling and demonstrating that he could interact with me respectfully without attempting to manipulate or guilt me into giving him money. These interactions were formal and limited, but they satisfied my commitment to Rose's memory without exposing myself to further emotional abuse or financial manipulation. The romance with David Chen, a social worker who specialized in elder abuse cases, developed naturally from our shared commitment to protecting vulnerable seniors and fighting against the kind of exploitation that had nearly destroyed my family. David had followed my case in the media and reached out initially to invite me to speak at a conference about elder abuse prevention, but our professional relationship quickly evolved into something deeper as we discovered our compatibility and shared values. His understanding of trauma and family dynamics helped me process the betrayal I'd experienced, while my business success inspired him to consider new approaches to advocacy and community organizing. My mentor role with other families facing elder abuse situations became one of the most meaningful aspects of my new life, allowing me to use my painful experience to help others avoid similar devastation. The foundation connected me with dozens of families who were dealing with financial exploitation, family manipulation, or legal challenges to inheritances, and I was able to provide both practical advice about legal strategies and emotional support from someone who truly understood what they were experiencing. Several families credited my guidance with helping them save their loved ones' assets and preserve family relationships that might otherwise have been destroyed by greed and manipulation. The educational speaking engagements at universities and professional conferences gave me a platform to raise awareness about elder abuse while building my own expertise in business management and family dynamics. Law schools invited me to speak about the legal strategies that had been effective in my case. Business schools wanted to hear about managing a family enterprise under extreme stress, and social work programs asked me to share insights about recognizing and responding to elder abuse. These speaking opportunities also connected me with experts in various fields who became valuable advisors for both my business and foundation activities. The scholarship fund I established in Rose's memory provided annual awards for culinary students who demonstrated both talent and financial need, ensuring that Rose's commitment to helping young people achieve their dreams would continue for generations. The first recipients were selected from applications that included essays about their career goals and their understanding of the restaurant industry's role in building community connections. Several scholarship recipients completed internships at our restaurants, learning both practical skills and business management principles that would serve them throughout their careers. The health advocacy work I undertook focused specifically on improving protection for elderly adults who were vulnerable to financial exploitation and medical manipulation by family members or caregivers. I testified before state legislative committees about the need for stronger oversight of power of attorney arrangements and better training for healthcare providers to recognize signs of elder abuse. The advocacy work was emotionally challenging because it required me to relive aspects of Rose's experience, but it was also deeply satisfying to know that my suffering might prevent similar tragedies for other families. The personal healing process was ongoing and complex, requiring professional therapy to address the trauma of being betrayed by family members and attacked so viciously by people who were supposed to love and protect me. The therapy helped me understand that Dad's behavior was driven by his own psychological issues and financial desperation rather than by anything I had done wrong, which was essential for rebuilding my self-confidence and ability to trust other people. The healing process also involved learning to set healthy boundaries in relationships and to recognize red flags that might indicate manipulation or exploitation. The financial wisdom I developed through managing Rose's inheritance responsibly ensured long-term security for both my personal future and the continued operation of the business empire she'd entrusted to me. I worked with investment advisors to diversify the portfolio beyond the restaurant business, purchasing real estate and securities that would provide steady income even if the restaurant industry faced challenges. The investment strategy also included provisions for continuing the foundation's work and ensuring that the scholarship fund would be permanently endowed to honor Rose's memory in perpetuity. The legacy planning I undertook was designed to prevent the kind of inheritance battle that had nearly destroyed Rose's wishes and our family relationships. I created detailed estate planning documents that clearly specified how the business and foundation should be managed if anything happened to me, with multiple layers of oversight and legal protection to prevent manipulation or exploitation by future family members or business partners. The planning process also included provisions for gradually transitioning ownership of the restaurants to longtime employees who shared Rose's values and commitment to community service. 2 years have passed since that devastating morning when Dad's security guard blocked me from sitting in the front row at Rose's funeral, and the transformation in my life has been so complete that sometimes I barely recognize the frightened young woman who sat in the back of that funeral home feeling utterly alone and defeated. The journey from victim to victor required every ounce of strength and determination I possessed, but it also revealed capabilities within myself that I never knew existed and taught me lessons about family, loyalty, and justice that will guide me for the rest of my life. Rose's final words about not trusting Dad and Linda have taken on deeper meaning as I've come to understand that her wisdom extended far beyond the specific warning about their intentions. She was teaching me to trust my own instincts about people's motivations, to document important relationships and agreements, and to never allow guilt or false claims about family loyalty to override my commitment to truth and justice. The hidden safe she'd mentioned contained not just important documents, but also letters she'd written to me over the years expressing her confidence in my ability to carry on her legacy and protect the values she'd spent her lifetime building into her business and community relationships. Dad's current situation is both tragic and entirely self-inflicted, a cautionary tale about how greed and desperation can destroy even the most basic family bonds. He completed his community service at the nursing home where he was required to help care for elderly residents, an experience that he claims gave him insight into the damage his actions had caused, but his occasional attempts at reconciliation still feel more motivated by financial desperation than genuine remorse. Our supervised holiday visits are cordial but distant, and while I've forgiven him for my own peace of mind, I will never again trust him with anything more important than casual conversation about weather and current events. Linda's letters from federal prison continue to arrive regularly despite my attorney's repeated requests that she cease all contact with me and my family. Her correspondence reveals the mind of someone who still doesn't fully accept responsibility for the harm she's caused, as she continues to present herself as a victim of circumstances and poor choices rather than as a predator who deliberately targeted vulnerable elderly people for financial exploitation. I donate her letters to the Foundation's educational programs as examples of how manipulators continue their psychological games even after being caught and prosecuted for their crimes. The family dynamics that emerged from this crisis have been permanently altered, but in ways that ultimately created stronger and more authentic relationships with the people who proved themselves worthy of trust and loyalty. Margaret and Frank have worked hard to rebuild their relationships with me, and while the trust will never be quite the same as it was before, we've found ways to maintain family connections that honor Rose's memory without exposing me to further manipulation or betrayal. The cousins who participated in Dad's character assassination have been permanently excluded from my life, a boundary that has brought peace rather than sadness. The business success that Rose's restaurants have achieved under my leadership proves that her confidence in my abilities was well-founded and that her legacy is in capable hands for the future. The 15 original locations are now generating nearly 40% more revenue than they did during Rose's final years, and the 3 new locations have exceeded all projections for customer volume and profitability. More importantly, the restaurants have maintained the family atmosphere and community connections that Rose valued above pure financial success, ensuring that her vision of business as a vehicle for serving others continues to guide every operational decision. My personal fulfillment comes primarily from the elder protection work that grew out of my determination to prevent other families from experiencing the kind of exploitation that nearly destroyed Rose's legacy and our family relationships. The foundation has assisted over 200 families in protecting elderly relatives from financial abuse, and our advocacy work has contributed to significant improvements in state laws governing power of attorney arrangements and elder abuse prosecution. Knowing that Rose's suffering led to protections that have prevented similar tragedies for others gives meaning to the pain we both endured during her final months. The relationship with David has evolved into a partnership that honors both of our commitments to protecting vulnerable people while building a personal life based on mutual respect and shared values. Our engagement represents not just a romantic milestone, but also a merger of our professional missions to fight exploitation and advocate for people who cannot protect themselves. The wedding we're planning for next summer will be held at the original restaurant location where Rose started her business empire, surrounded by the employees and community members who supported me through the darkest period of my life. My continued advocacy as a national spokesperson for elder abuse prevention has connected me with lawmakers, healthcare providers, and family advocates across the country who are working to improve protections for vulnerable seniors. The speaking engagements and media interviews I do are opportunities to share Rose's story and my own experience in ways that educate people about the warning signs of elder abuse and the resources available to families who suspect exploitation. Each time I tell our story, I honor Rose's memory while potentially saving another family from experiencing similar devastation. The final wisdom that has emerged from this ordeal is the understanding that real family relationships are defined by loyalty, respect, and genuine care rather than by blood connections or legal obligations. The restaurant employees who stood by me during the legal battle, the community members who supported Rose's legacy, and the new friends who emerged from my advocacy work have proven themselves to be more trustworthy and loving than many of the biological relatives who turned against me when money was involved. Rose always said that family is what you build through your choices and actions, not what you inherit through accident of birth. Rose's living legacy continues to grow through every meal served in her restaurants, every scholarship awarded in her name, and every elderly person protected from exploitation through the Foundation's work. The $4.7 million inheritance that Dad and Linda tried so desperately to steal has grown to over $8 million through careful investment and business expansion, but more importantly, it has generated resources for community service and elder protection that will continue Rose's mission of caring for others long after my own lifetime. The money was never the real inheritance. The true gift Rose left me was the knowledge of my own strength and the responsibility to use that strength in service of others. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money, but the courage to fight for what's right, and the wisdom to know that real family stands by you when the world turns against you. Rose's love gave me the foundation to survive betrayal and build something meaningful from the ashes of broken relationships, and her memory continues to guide every decision I make about business, family, and service to others. The front row seat that Dad denied me at her funeral was nothing compared to the place of honor I've earned in carrying forward her values and protecting the legacy she worked her entire life to build. What would you have done if your own family tried to steal your inheritance and destroy your reputation? Have you ever had to fight against people who were supposed to love and protect you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button to help others find it. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories about family drama, inheritance battles, and finding justice when the system seems stacked against you. Share this video with anyone who might be dealing with elder abuse or family betrayal, because sometimes knowing you're not alone makes all the difference. Thank you for listening to Rose's story and mine, and may you always have the courage to fight for what's right, even when the people closest to you become your greatest enemies. Until next time, remember that your real family is the one that stands by you when everything falls apart.